I think in Afghanistan it is difficult to define where the front line is because you're working in an environment with an insurgent force that is everywhere and can be whoever they want at any time. They can be a civilian or they can be Taliban. So it's very difficult to define. I was quite surprised that the army was sending me as a woman over to Afghanistan because I'd heard the stories about how the Afghan men wouldn't speak to me because I was a woman. So before we left, actually, I'd trained my sergeant to basically speak on my behalf, that he and I would go out on the patrols together, but if it got to the stage where the men were turning their backs on me or not listening to me, that he would become my mouthpiece, almost like having a second interpreter there for me. But it was interesting to note that I never ran into those problems at all. Our commanding officers on both of my deployments took a very pragmatic view to having women in their task force. I think they saw it as an opportunity and the fact that we could be used to talk to both sides of the population. I really had the best of both worlds. I could talk to the men and I could talk to the women, whereas men could generally only talk to the men. My first impressions of Tarankout in particular in 2006, and I vividly remember the first patrol that I did into Tarankout. The streets were desolate. There was no real movement on the streets. There was about 20 cars in Tarankout at the time, and most of them were run down. The road from Tarankout to Kandahar had been cut off, and most people couldn't afford to pay the Taliban the price that they were asking for the safe passage. Within the bazaar, which was the local marketplace, there was absolutely no movement whatsoever. People were selling their goods behind closed doors because they were genuinely scared of just being out in the open. And there wasn't much to sell anyway because there was no movement of any of the food or supplies from Kandahar in the first place. It was interesting to see too, there was no signs of government within Tarankout. So there were 2 security checkpoints at either end of town, which had blood stains still in their vicinity from where IEDs had gone off. The locals manning these checkpoints weren't wearing uniforms and they were basically just collecting bribes from people who were outside their tribes. There was also just no progress being made. So most of the buildings were derelict, they were falling down. Most of them were made of adobe or rammed mud earth, and nobody really had any will to repair them. Nobody was looking forward to the future and they were just surviving on a day-to-day basis. When we initially did our recons into Tarankout, we received part of our handover and some of the training we did was with the Special Forces. They always looked rather dubiously at us, particularly at me on some occasions, wondering what we were going to be doing outside the wire. Their role was obviously very different to us, and we were there, I suppose, for a softer role in terms of the reconstruction we were dealing with. But they did look at us, and I remember on one occasion one of the SAS guys looking at me going, "You're all going to die if you go to that location," and he kind of looked distinctly at me, but that was okay because I lived to tell the tale. In 2006, you'd look out into Tarankout and it was just blackness. You'd look into the valleys and you couldn't see them because it was blackness. The camp that was being constructed while we were there was just black again. The only time on picket that you'd actually see lights is when troops were in contact up in the valleys, and then all of the flares would be going off and you could see the sparks of gunfire up and down the valleys. We were on our initial patrols trying to gather that information, but because it seemed so simple to the locals, they didn't really want to talk to us about what tribe they were. They knew where they lived, they knew who their tribe was, and if we didn't understand that, then we were clearly not on the same page as them. So it was really difficult, and it was really difficult particularly with the engineering works without this information to know whether we were targeting the right groups, whether we were aiding at all in the corruption, or whether we were marginalising another tribal group because they weren't the ones winning the contract. The good news is that particularly the Reconstruction Task Force worked hard and we worked as a team, and certainly every effort when we needed information got put into trying to figure that out. As an engineer, you have to weigh up the fact that if you employ a local contractor who may be a contractor by name only and have no engineering skills, that money is obviously going to feed back into the local community, but they might not actually be able to build that bridge or that hospital for you. Whereas if you employed somebody who was maybe outside the province who could actually build a bridge, but they may not divert those funds back into the local population and they wouldn't be of the same tribal group. So we were always weighing up those considerations. And I think rightly, and on the commanding officer's guidance, we would choose the local companies over the companies that resided outside of Uruzgan province. One of my very first patrols was into the Tarankout Hospital. It was very interesting in these early stages. I was an engineer, so I was there to do reconnaissance and survey the building requirements. So look at the water supply, there was none. Look at whether they had power, and again, there was no power, so the survey was quite short. And also to see the state of the building. And certainly the women were in the side of the hospital that was most derelict, particularly in the postnatal room, which was not occupied. The whole roof was collapsing down. It was quite interesting to see what wasn't in the women's side of the hospital. There were women and there were young boys, so boys about under the age of 10. But there were no babies and there were no pregnant women in the hospital. And when I found the head nurse, who was a rather robust lady with great opinions, she said that the men didn't allow women to come and give birth in the hospital because Allah decided about life and death. Birth was about life and death, so if the mother died or if the baby died, then that was Allah's will. And what she wanted, because I was also there to seek out what the priorities were, what she wanted was to be able to convince men to send their women, their wives, to hospital to give birth. And we got into a conversation about how we could possibly do that. She certainly led that conversation, and she must have known about market forces, because she said that if we could give the men an incentive for the women to come to the hospital, that they'd be more inclined to come. And that would comprise of things like baby clothes or oils and soaps, because she also noted that most women after they gave birth didn't even have anything to wrap their children in. So we didn't promise anything that day, but by the next patrol when we went back, we were able to deliver baby gifts to her. And that was quite remarkable to see the absolute change in her opinion towards us, because she was still scared about talking to us, particularly if the Taliban found out, to see that we could deliver something and that it met her priority, which then allowed us to get some of our carpenters and electricians within the buildings. So my first impressions of Tarankout were that it was quite a stark, desolate town. Nobody really with the will to move forward because they were really in survival mode. In the early days where we were trying to build reinforced concrete structures because we wanted them to last more than 2 years, that the mud earth structures would generally last, that we'd turn up on site and the contractor would be trying to put straw into the reinforced concrete because it's a wonderful material in mud earth. It doesn't quite have the same impact in concrete, unfortunately. So we would have to teach them from the very basics about how to do construction, because none of them were carpenters or electricians or plumbers or even engineers, but we were giving them an engineer task to do. But that played in very nicely with capacity building, teaching the locals how to do it, them taking ownership of the project so that they wanted it to be built and that it would be there and there for their future. The winter was bitterly cold. I think the coldest I was on a patrol overnight, and I think it was -17 at that point in time. And we were all sleeping on the side, under canvas on the side of the Bushmasters. To work in dust storms and into 40-degree plus heat is quite physically demanding, particularly with the amount of equipment that we were carrying. But you always managed to get through. I remember though when we did a mission to Zabul and Ghazni provinces, which were more desolate than what Uruzgan province was, and we had these extreme and immense dust storms come through to the point where you couldn't open your eyes, you couldn't even breathe half the time, and your lungs were just, I think, became a filter for dust, going from the extreme dust and heat in summer to extreme colds when you're designing different buildings. It's a tremendous challenge. So it was a challenge, I think, both personally and also in an engineering sense. But when you're with a team, I think you can endure any hardship that Mother Nature throws at you. I think paving the way for the future Reconstruction Task Forces, and then the MRTFs and the MTFs after that was very important. I'll always remember my first patrol back into Tarankout in 2008. From the moment we left the base, I really couldn't stop grinning because the change was just vast. From where there had been absolute desolate streets, there was now a real buzz about the town. The 20 cars that I'd seen in 2006 had multiplied into hundreds, which was providing a real security challenge for our force. The local population were actually building. So before, when they were in 2006, where the population was in pure survival mode, you now saw locals very visibly in the street, very proudly building out of adobe, some even out of reinforced concrete. And it showed that not only did they have the funds for this and did they have the skills to build this, but they also had the hope that they'd obviously be alive tomorrow, because why else would they be building? The bazaar, which had been very desolate in 2006, had expanded by about 200 metres of shops selling all sorts of different things. So not just the basic supplies of food and fuel, but they were selling a lot of the construction materials that people were now buying. They were selling clothes, and they were selling even toys for children. So there was this real buzz about the town, and I remember when we got to the roundabout in Tarankout, we were actually stopped by the National Police, which were then waving us through in some sort of traffic control. And again, the security forces seemed to be a little concerned about this, but I thought this was marvellous, because in 2006 this hadn't existed. Uniforms hadn't existed. Also on that first patrol, there were women walking in the street. In 2006, I think I'd seen about 5 women walking the street, and they'd had male escorts. The women going into the hospital in 2006 had to arrive before dawn because they weren't allowed to be seen. On this one patrol, I saw over 10 women in the street, some of them not accompanied by any male relative. And I even saw a couple of them who weren't wearing a full burqa. Their faces were fully visible, and they didn't even scurry away from our patrol when they saw us. So it was really quite tremendous to see the changes. So in RTF4, it was a continuation on the work that had been done by the previous Reconstruction Task Forces. We were at that stage doing top-down projects in Tarankout, so really supporting the provincial ministries, whether that be MRRD, the Ministry for Rural Rehabilitation and Development, the Provincial Director in Health and the Provincial Director in Education, in order to get some of the fundamental things for the province in place. So the major high schools, the major hospitals, training centres for the health services, so that not only did they have a functioning hospital, but they had staff that could be trained locally in order to feed into that hospital. We also, by RTF4, we were working well and truly outside of Tarankout, up in the Chora area, in the Chora Valley, and also in Sauk Magab. And that was a continuation of the good work that had been done prior to that. There's many things that stick in my mind, but a memory that I really cherish is when we were working on the Tarankout Causeway. It was a priority because men and women used to drown in this river as they tried to access schools and hospitals during the snowmelt. And because we were building in winter, it had been quite difficult to progress the project quickly, but we were doing it module by module. When the snowmelt happened, it happened very quickly, and it also coincided with a massive amount of rain. And the rain basically flooded the entire causeway site. And we'd just put in 2 modules on this bridge that would have been washed away. We didn't know this at the time, but that night the locals, the tribal elder there, got the whole town up, moved them down to the causeway site, got sandbags, barricaded the whole site, again without us asking, because his men had been working on this project. They really wanted the project, and Mother Nature was not going to stop even these 2 modules being floated away. It also showed that what we were doing, it wasn't us doing this, it was the local population. And that's what we were there to do. We were there to progress them towards the Afghan society that they wanted, and it's a moment that I'll never forget.